heads for the price of one. Either two or none. Without a treaty of alliance with Egypt, you could not hold the territories under your command.
Imagine walking through ancient Egypt and suddenly stumbling upon the great Cleopatra dressed in slave clothing, physically inebriated, with a bottle of wine in hand. This is the side of the story historians never tell. Beyond the charming beauty and brilliant leadership skills, Cleopatra's life story had a separate side most people don't know. Filled with bloodshed, sibling rivalries, and ancient laboratories, history has long forgotten. Get ready to stretch the limits of your imagination as we explore 15 weird things you did not know about Cleopatra. Number 15. Drinking problems. Stories about Cleopatra often portray her as an enigmatic queen, with a wealth of wisdom and an irresistible charm no one else could compete with. While all of these are true, not a lot of people know how much the Egyptian queen loved to have fun. When she's not making critical political decisions about the nation, or fending off her many enemies trying to snatch her throne, Cleopatra fancied a good drinking bout, sometimes until she was drunk to stupor. Just like most of the other ancient civilizations, the Egyptians had a thing for wine. This was especially common among the rich and powerful, who would throw lavish drunken parties lasting for hours or even days. Cleopatra was not exempted from this tradition, which was further exacerbated when she began a legendary love affair with the Roman general Mark Antony in the year 41 BC. While their relationship was basically for mutual political benefits, Antony protecting Cleopatra's throne and the queen, in turn, providing him with unlimited riches and resources, they also had quite a strange history. According to ancient sources, Cleopatra and Antony spent a great deal of time drinking, and even formed their own exclusive drinking society, accurately named the Inimitable Livers. Together with other Egyptian and Roman elites, Cleopatra and his partner organized nightly feasts, exotic parties, as well as elaborate games and contests. But their favorite activities involved getting blind drunk, dressing up in disguise, and playing pranks on their citizens. Picture the incredible Cleopatra clad in slave clothings, jumping out of corners to scare unsuspecting residents, and making a public display no one expected of a queen. Of course, many Egyptian royals criticized her actions and constantly degraded her in the corners of their hearts, but this never stopped her from having fun and taking a sip of wine anytime she wanted. Number 14. Her true ancestry. When Netflix announced the release of a new series titled Queen Cleopatra back in 2023, portraying the famous Egyptian matriarch as a black character, a controversial debate emerged on social media about whether this portrayal was accurate or a gross misrepresentation. Centuries after her death, Cleopatra's racial identity remains a subject of question. So in order to solve this mystery, let's dive a bit into the historical background. You see, when Cleopatra was born in Alexandria, Egypt back in the year 69 BC, the era of the pharaohs had disappeared, and the empire was being ruled by a Greek dynasty known as the Ptolemaic dynasty. During this time, Egypt had developed into a melting pot of cultures and ethnicities, so it wasn't uncommon to find people from all walks of life who traveled there for trade and commerce. The Ptolemaic themselves were a Macedonian Greek dynasty that started ruling Egypt in the days after Alexander the Great conquered the land. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was definitely Greek, but the true ethnicity of her mother, Cleopatra V Tryphena, is up for question. Some say she was ethnically Egyptian, which many historians today would classify as black. Although it is important to note that the notion of black or white has been rejected in the context of ancient Egypt, since scholars believe such a distinction is anachronistic and doesn't apply in the context of the time frame. Others also claim she was of Greek descent, although she likely had some Macedonian background as well. It is also worth noting that Cleopatra's family had intermarried with the Egyptian royalty for centuries, which means her bloodline was likely mixed, with links that may spread as far as Persia and Syria. Then there are those who believe that Ptolemy XII, her father, was from Nubia, an African civilization which existed alongside ancient Egypt in what is now known as Sudan and some parts of southern Egypt. Some historians also speculate that Ptolemy probably had a Nubian concubine or wife, who in turn gave birth to Cleopatra. But these are mere theories with no solid evidence to back them up, and since much of her history has been lost to the passage of time, it's practically impossible to draw conclusions on her ethnicity at this point. That is, unless someone builds a time machine so we can travel back to ancient Egypt and catch a glimpse of the queen in person. Number 14. How Cleopatra Met Julius Caesar. Queen Cleopatra was involved with a few powerful men in her lifetime, with her most famous entanglement being with the famous ruler of Rome, Julius Caesar. While the relationship itself was controversial, the story of how Cleopatra met Caesar is even stranger than fiction. This epic tale takes us back to between 49 and 45 BC, when Julius Caesar was embroiled in a bitter civil war with his rival Pompey. After losing the Battle of Pharsalus in the year 48 BC, Pompey fled to Egypt to seek refuge under the protection of Ptolemy XIII, co-ruler of Egypt. Under some rather strange circumstances, Ptolemy XIII ordered Achillid and Lucius Septimius to execute Pompey so he could gain Caesar's favor. As soon as Caesar reached the Egyptian palace, Ptolemy had Pompey's head waiting for him, but he then began to cry upon learning of his death. Julius Caesar was then offered an opportunity to stick around for a while in Egypt, which was when news of his presence reached Cleopatra. But even though she was a high ruler in Egypt, Cleopatra wasn't allowed to meet Caesar like she wanted. So she devised a clever plan, instructing one of her servants to wrap her up in a carpet and have her carried to Caesar's chambers. Once the servant arrived in Caesar's private room, the carpet was unfurled, and the graceful queen emerged in the presence of the Roman conqueror. Not surprisingly, Caesar loved this presentation and preferred it to Pompey's head, and an instant connection emerged between Cleopatra and Caesar, one that would last until his death. No one really knows what happened in that room that day, but it created a bond that solidified Cleopatra's reign and boosted Caesar's power and wealth in the years that followed. Number 13. Queen of Incest. As weird as Cleopatra's meeting with Caesar was, though, the background of the whole story takes an even stranger dimension. You see, prior to this alliance with the Roman dictator, the queen was married to Ptolemy XIII as mandated by their father, Ptolemy XII Auletes. As stated in his established condition before his death, Ptolemy Auletes ordered that his two children get married so they could both exert control over the territories of Egypt. Since the words of an Egyptian king held as much weight as the commands of the gods, the order was carried out without question, and so brother and sister became man and wife. The only problem was that Cleopatra was 18 at the time, while Ptolemy XIII was 10. This, coupled with the queen's understanding of politics, meant she held more power than her brother, who obviously didn't want to share the rulership of Egypt. On Cleopatra's end, both she and the members of her court were satisfied with ruling alongside Ptolemy, but the king's advisors sought to take the whole kingdom, and so they began plotting against her. It didn't take long for their plans to bear the fruit they wanted, forcing Cleopatra to leave Egypt and flee to Syria. This epic sibling rivalry remains one of the most unforgettable stories emerging out of ancient Egypt, but that's not where it ends. While Ptolemy celebrated his victory, Cleopatra quietly returned to Alexandria, established an unshakable alliance with Julius Caesar, and subsequently regained her foothold of authority in Egypt. By the order of Caesar, ancient Egypt was to be ruled once again by brother and sister, but this didn't stop Ptolemy from seeking his sister's death. His second attempt, however, resulted in a civil war that filled the streets of Egypt with violence and bloodshed. Once again, Cleopatra left the city and traveled to meet up with Julius Caesar, convincing him to bring his army and conquer Egypt on her behalf. The battle was fierce, and the war was bloody, but in the end, Ptolemy suffered a terrible defeat, and this time, he was the one who got run out of Alexandria. Unfortunately, Ptolemy XIII would later drown in the River Nile while on his way out, bringing an unexpected end to the Egyptian power tussle. Number 12. Second marriage and illegitimate son. Contrary to modern tradition, sibling marriage and inbreeding wasn't a taboo in ancient Egypt. As a matter of fact, the royal families of Egypt ensured their children married within the family to preserve the sanctity of the bloodline. So, right after Ptolemy XIII's death, the now 22-year-old Cleopatra picked her 12-year-old brother Ptolemy XIV as her next husband, which means she married not one, but two of her siblings. At this same time, Cleopatra was also in a relationship with Caesar, and they even had a son named Caesarion. But even though their love waxed strong, Caesar and Cleopatra couldn't solidify their union in marriage since Roman royals were forbidden from marrying foreigners. As for Ptolemy XIV, his incestuous marriage was mostly political, and historians believe it was likely never consummated. Unfortunately, though, the marriage was also short-lived, as he was murdered not long after the union was finalized, and many sources claim it was Cleopatra herself who ordered him assassinated. She would eventually continue ruling over Egypt, along with her son for many years, before she also met her end. Number 11. Education and mastery of language. Beyond drunken shenanigans, strings of relationships, and the fight for power, Cleopatra was also renowned for her impressive education, which made her one of Egypt's most successful leaders. Arising out of the prestigious Ptolemaic dynasty, where education was highly prioritized, Cleopatra and her siblings had access to the best teachers and great works of literature, studying everything from history to astronomy, philosophy, chemistry, medicine, zoology, and even international relations. She was also well trained in the art of public speaking, a skill that eventually paid off after she ascended the throne. As queen, she would often hold public discourse with her subjects, addressing them on the state of the country, and unveiling her many plans for Egypt's defense, prosperity, and expansion. Ancient historians say, it was a pleasure merely to hear the sound of her voice, and more so because she gained mastery of a few languages, including ancient Greek, the language of the Parthians, Jews, Medes, Syrians, Ethiopians, and Arabs. She was also the only member of her descendants who spoke the native Egyptian language and also wrote and understood hieroglyphics, which was one of the reasons she was loved by her citizens throughout her reign. History also records how Cleopatra spent hours on end in some kind of ancient lab, where she conducted research on herbs and cosmetics. Sadly, all her research works were lost after a great fire engulfed the Great Library of Alexandria in 48 AD. Number 10. What Cleopatra really looked like. Often described as one of the most beautiful women out of Egypt, Cleopatra's physical charm has been a subject of discussion for many decades. But describing what she really looked like is a tricky subject that hasn't been cracked despite years of study. Roman historian Cassius Dio described her as a woman of surpassing beauty. Hollywood portrays her as a glamorous seductress. But was she really that beautiful? Or has she been wrongly depicted due to lack of proper information? It's not news that Egyptian artists painted and sculpted their pharaohs to make them look better than they actually did, with pot-bellied pharaohs appearing with chiseled abs. So it's not surprising that some historians claim her beauty was exaggerated even with very little historical context backing up the claim. One of the few pieces of evidence we have in modern times to help understand how stunning Cleopatra was are these small coins bearing her supposed image. While the description offered by these coins aligns with Hollywood's depiction of an incredibly beautiful Cleopatra, some skeptics claim this was probably the work of an unskilled artist or intentionally exaggerated to make her appear more beautiful than she actually was. However, historians believe the image on these coins were crafted to represent Cleopatra's real attributes, save for some distinctions like large noses and determined chins, which were slightly exaggerated. It is also worth noting that while the coins were printed in a variety of places and by different artists, they are generally consistent in details, meaning they were likely copied from an official portrait showcasing Cleopatra's real appearance. Although recent attempts at reimagining Cleopatra have produced conflicting results, most historians generally agree that she was extremely beautiful and a charming sight to behold. Number 9. Strange beauty treatment. Being naturally beautiful meant that Cleopatra had to put in the work to maintain her charm, with much of her skincare routine raising the bar for modern beauty standards. As an Egyptian royal, Cleopatra paid special attention to her appearance, employing the use of both regular and bizarre skincare products and techniques, many of which have been incorporated by the modern beauty industry. According to historical records, Cleopatra loved to use honey on her face as an antibacterial agent, and she would also wash her face many times a day using oil and chalk, or oil and lime. Some also claim she washed her face with apple cider vinegar, and her long list of skincare products including the use of ginger, antimony, calamine, onions, goose fat, and turpentine powder, among others. To make her pimple marks disappear, Cleopatra used rosewater, and to exfoliate her body and skin, she applied sea salt scrub. As for face and body makeup, the Egyptian queen applied natural nail polish made from henna, giving her fingernails a lovely reddish-brown color. Sometimes in place of henna, she used a mixture of juniper berries, oil, and 2 plants that have never been identified to dye her hair, as well as applying olive oil to enrich the texture. Her most popular beauty secret, however, was milk, which she would often soak herself in for extended periods, and sometimes mix with olive oil to moisturize her skin. Number 8. Jewelry collection. As high ruler over all of Egypt, Cleopatra controlled the empire's thriving industries and innumerable sources of income. Historians believe that in her heyday, the queen was worth the equivalent of $96 billion in today's money, making her one of the 5 richest women to ever live. With such immense wealth at her disposal, Cleopatra enjoyed a life of luxury, amassing a huge collection of jewels that was both extensive and varied. There were countless precious gemstones, diamonds, pearls, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies. She also owned several gold jewelry, including specially crafted crowns, necklaces, earrings, and bracelets, which she adorned herself with whether on regular days or special occasions. But besides wearing them as adornments, she also believed precious gemstones possessed special protection powers, so she would wear them as amulets, sometimes featuring images of Egyptian gods and goddesses, as well as sacred animals. In addition, Cleopatra also ensured she was adorned in jewelry as an expression of her immense power and wealth, often using them to gain more allies and exert influence over her neighboring communities. By offering gifts of gold and precious stones to her fellow rulers, Cleopatra won their love, admiration, and loyalty, which was one of the reasons her reign was firmly established until it was uprooted by a brutal war. Her closet was also tilled with dresses encrusted with pearls, shoes made with precious stones, and a special necklace made of pearls strung together with gold thread. Who could also forget her golden serpent bracelet, made of pure gold and set with precious stones, which she often wore on diplomatic missions and during special occasions to symbolize the power and authority of a pharaoh. Number 7. What happened to Cleopatra's sister? Earlier, we talked about how the Egyptian queen was almost ousted from power by her husband and brother. But there's one character in this tussle that's often overlooked: Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV. Although popular culture only mentions Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, their father actually had 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. What most people don't also realize is that every single one of these royal children reigned in Egypt at one point or the other, although Cleopatra was the only one whose reign lasted very long. When Ptolemy XIII sought to capture the kingdom from her sister's hands, he wasn't working alone. He had help from Arsinoe, who historians believe was actually his twin sister, and also wanted a taste of the power that came with being the ruler of Egypt. While Cleopatra and Ptolemy were going at it in 48 BC, Arsinoe took the opportunity to declare herself the rival pharaoh, Arsinoe IV of Egypt, a decision that didn't sit well with a lot of people, including the Romans. But when Julius Caesar eventually waded into the conflict and handed Egypt back to Cleopatra and Ptolemy, he didn't leave Arsinoe empty-handed. Instead, he gave her and her little brother, Ptolemy XIV, control over Cyprus as compensation. But this was never enough for the younger sister, who wanted all or nothing, so he conspired with Ptolemy XIII to take back the country from Cleopatra. In the Great War that followed, Arsinoe aligned herself with the general Achilid, who was carrying out a destructive siege on Alexandria, the capital of Egypt at the time. After gaining control of the operation, Arsinoe and Achilid then got into some simple disputes, and out of anger, she ordered his execution, replacing him with her mentor, Ganymede. But whatever hope Cleopatra's younger sister had of gaining the throne was dashed when her own troops went behind her back to negotiate with Julius Caesar to exchange her for Ptolemy XIII, who was being held captive at that point in the Civil War. By the time Roman reinforcements arrived, Caesar won easily, and the teenage Arsinoe was captured and transported to Rome, bound in chains and shamefully paraded as a symbol of victory. However, by the mercy of Julius Caesar, Arsinoe was spared from execution, and only exiled to spend the rest of life in the Temple of Artemis, located in Ephesus. Number 6. The other Ptolemy sister. Speaking of complicated family trees, Cleopatra's lineage is as crazy as they come, because by the end of her life, she was likely the only surviving child of her father, as the rest had been murdered or exiled whether by herself or Ptolemy, her father. Since we've discussed the details of how the rest of her siblings died, the story of her only older sister also bears mentioning. Her name was Berenice IV, and although very little is known about her life, her execution is quite the popular story because it came at the hands of her own father. The story takes us to the year 58 BC, when Ptolemy was driven from Egypt by the constant threats of insurrection, and fled to Rome, leaving his queen and kids behind. Shortly after his departure, the queen died, and since she was the oldest daughter, Berenice was declared the new queen of Egypt. This was where things took an interesting turn. In 57 BC, Ptolemy began the process of reclaiming his throne by bribing the Romans and spinning several stories to get them on his side, so they could help him take back what he lost. However, the people of Alexandria didn't want him back on the throne, so they sent a delegation to Rome, refuting the former king's allegations against them and presenting their own charges of his misrule and abuse of power. Ptolemy, on the other hand, was a ruthless man who wanted power at all costs, so he quietly arranged for the delegates to be murdered, although their death was never really traced back to him. As Ptolemy continued seeking alliances with powerful people in Rome to help him in his course, the Alexandrians at home were trying to get a prince for Berenice, who they had accepted as their new leader. By 56 BC, their search led them to a Pontic prince named Archelaus, who was soon united with Berenice in marriage. Everything went sour the following year when Ptolemy finally found an ally in the Roman proconsul of Syria, Aulus Gabinius, and together they marched against Alexandria and took it back by force. When the war was over, Ptolemy brought out his own daughter and executed her along with her supporters. Before we unveil more strange facts about Cleopatra, here's our subscribers' pick for today. While making a list of all the weird things you did not know about Cleopatra, one story that stands out is her relationship with her own brothers. While this wasn't a strange occurrence in ancient Egypt, imagining a marriage between a child and a teenager seems quite strange in the modern setting. This hieroglyphic, depicting the king and queen having a private moment, paints the bizarre picture of what it would have been like for Cleopatra and Ptolemy after their marriage was sealed. However, some historians believe the entire union was only for show and was likely never consummated. With Cleopatra having had children with notable figures like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and no record of any child born to Ptolemy, it's safe to say all there was to it was politics. Share your thoughts on this inbred marriage and other weird Cleopatra facts with us in the comments section. Now, let's get back to the video. Number 5. The truth about Cleopatra's eye makeup. Most depictions of Cleopatra feature the trademark eye makeup, a major part of the distinctive features that set her apart from other queens of her time. This black coal that formed decorative spirals around her eye, however, wasn't just a beauty product, but actually served another important purpose. Of all the weird things you did not know about Cleopatra, this could possibly be the strangest. According to researchers, the eyeliner was concocted from 4 different lead-based materials, capable of protecting her eyes from the infections that plagued ordinary Egyptians. This was because ancient Egyptians had a serious issue with infections of this nature, which usually emerged whenever the River Nile flooded, bringing all sorts of marshy gunk into the water, which in turn caused severe inflammation. But since the makeup was too toxic to the bacteria bearing the infections, Cleopatra was shielded from the disease, although on the other end, it also exposed her to the risk of lead poisoning. Number 4. Cleopatra's perfume factory. Not only did Cleopatra look breathtakingly gorgeous wherever she went, but she also put in serious effort to make sure she smelled nice. As a lover of good fragrance and a renowned chemist of her time, the famous Queen of Egypt not only owned a wide array of perfumes, but actually produced her own products on a large scale. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra owned a special lab where she experimented with several ingredients, diluted several plants and herbs, and curated a list of perfume recipes. But according to historians, Cleopatra didn't essentially use perfumes as mere fragrance, but also as a tool of persuasion. For example, while on her way to meet the Roman politician and her future lover, Mark Antony, Cleopatra doused her ship's sails with perfume so she could present herself with sweet fragrance and ensnare his heart. It worked. Today, you can find what's left of Cleopatra's perfume factory by the Dead Sea near En-Gedi, and judging by some of the seating still standing there, historians believe it also operated as a day spa where people came to get proper beauty treatments. Number 3. How did she really die? Her reign was long, her time was memorable, and her story was dramatic and fascinating. But like every good thing, Cleopatra's reign had to come to an end. But the epic tale of how she died remains one of the most disputed parts of her history. The story takes us to the year 31 BC, when Roman forces crushed the Egyptian army in the epic Battle of Actium, pushing Antony and Cleopatra into a debilitating retreat back to Alexandria. But as they battled enemies from the outside, the royal couple also faced betrayal within their own courts, as former friends and allies began defecting to the invading forces of the Roman conqueror, Octavian. Seeing that the end was near, the couple dissolved their Society of Inimitable Livers and founded a new group called Companions to the Death, filled with loyalists who weren't willing to trade their loyalty. Cleopatra also commissioned the construction of a 2-story mausoleum within the palace, right next to the temple of the goddess Isis. But by the end of July in the year 30 BC, Octavian's armed forces had reached Alexandria, and as Cleopatra had planned, she retreated to her special mausoleum. Rumors soon began spreading that she had taken her own life, reaching her beloved Antony, who couldn't bear the news that his lover was dead, and fell on his own sword. His men carried him to Cleopatra, who surprisingly was still alive, and he died in her arms. Following this incident, Cleopatra found no reason to keep living, and with her enemy closing in, she decided to end it all. But before she took her own life, Cleopatra sent a letter to Octavian with a single request: to be buried by Octavian's side, and after that was delivered, she and her 2 servants ingested a mix of poison made from hemlock, opium, and aconite. She was 39 and had ruled Egypt for more than 20 years. After her body was discovered, stories began to spread that she didn't actually take her own life, but was bitten by a snake while hiding in the mausoleum, and others claim she actually ingested the snake's venom instead. Till today, the mystery surrounding how Cleopatra died has never been solved. But then again, that's not where the intrigue ends. Number 2. Where is Cleopatra's tomb? Even in death, Queen Cleopatra continues to captivate our imaginations, especially with the unsolved mystery surrounding her burial place. It's common knowledge that her final request to be buried beside Mark Antony was accepted by Octavian, but the exact location of this tomb is what no one has been able to figure out. Most archaeologists have come to the conclusion that Cleopatra's grave should be located in ancient Alexandria, but the problem with that is, the city is now submerged under the Mediterranean Sea, so it's likely her temple and remains have been lost forever. An underwater archaeologist named Frank Gaudio embarked on a deep exploration of the waters around Alexandria extensively back in the early 2000s, but found no signs of any structure linked to the Queen. This prompted mainstream archaeologists to shift their focus from the sea to the Nile, postulating that the grave was likely locked away in a watery abyss. Even after several failed attempts, scientists are not giving up on finding Cleopatra's possibly mummified remains, and they might just be onto something with the recent discovery of a tunnel that could possibly solve this ancient mystery. Number 1. The Secret Tunnel. Underneath the ruins of a temple in the Egyptian city of Taposiris Magna, archaeologists recently discovered a secret tunnel which many have described as a geometric miracle. But beyond the massive size and depth of this tunnel, there was a tiny little detail that made the discovery quite fascinating. Since it was submerged underwater and located around one of the areas archaeologists believe Cleopatra's temple was situated, theories began to emerge that this could actually be the final resting place of the last Egyptian queen. But based on the study that has been carried out at the site, the possibility of finding Cleopatra and Antony is gradually being ruled out, with archaeologists now setting their sights on their new sites emerging across Egypt. Will they ever find it, though? Only time will tell. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.